Okay, guys, a little different format today, obviously. Hopefully, everything goes away soon. Hopefully, the Rona is just done and we can go back to our ordinary lives, be back at school. It's like thinking of better times right now, right? But anyway, so we are done with the cell completely. We're out of the cell, we're done with the microscopic level. And we're going to move on to the last two things we got to go over, which is evolution and ecology. And then after we're done with evolution and after we're done with ecology, we are going to move on to, well, that's it. That's the end of the year. So, yeah. Anyway, so to start with evolution, we're going to go over today biogenesis. And biogenesis is simply living things coming from other living things. I think you guys learned this in, I don't know, fourth grade or something like that, that living things reproduce or they give rise to other living things. And all of this started, this basic concept of biogenesis started in the 1600s because people actually didn't believe it. They thought, yeah, sure, living things can give rise to other living things, but also living things don't really have to be brought about through other living things. In other words, non-living things can give rise to living things. Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense, right? In other words, like your table that you might be sitting at right now, 5 days from now, we might have some nice tasty mushrooms coming up from there. Maybe some mold or something like that, but I don't think any mushrooms will be growing out of your table. So anyway, that's spontaneous generation, that non-living things can give rise to living things, and that was the basis back then. That's what people believed in. There was this guy, his name was Francesco Redi, and he proposed the principle of biogenesis, which is the first thing that, hey, look, we got living organisms and they have to come from other living organisms, all right? In other words, our monkey and our lovely fox up there, okay? In order to give rise to little ones, okay, we got to be living to begin with. Seems very simple, right? But anyway, so Francisco Redi, he worked with meat and flies. Really cutting edge materials to say the least. But what he did, let me show you his experiment. He had three different jars. One had cork on it. The middle one had a piece of gauze, which things can get through. All right. In other words, go outside right now with a piece of gauze on your face. Okay. That is not a good mask to use. Okay. The Rona can get right through there. All right. So, yeah. Social isolation is a good thing right now, guys. But anyway, so back to Francesco Redi. On the first container there, the one on the far left, he put a piece of cork in the top of it. And what that cork did is it prohibited any flies or any air getting to it, so nothing can get to the meat at all. The second one in the middle, we had our flies, but they couldn't get to the meat. The flies could smell the meat, but they couldn't get and actually touch the meat. And you're probably wondering, what are those little things on top of the gauze? Fly poop? No, it's not fly poop. What that is, those are maggots. In other words, when flies lay eggs, the eggs give rise to maggots. Kind of gross. But since the flies could smell the meat and they couldn't get to the meat, they just laid their eggs on top of the gauze, and then the eggs hatched and we had maggots on top. All right. The last one, the flies, because it was completely open, the flies were able to get to the meat. They were able to lay their eggs on and in the meat, and then the maggots, erupted from the eggs, and the maggots then were able to eat the meat to provide them with nutrition. So pretty much in his conclusion, he's like, okay, look. We got some maggots, all right? And one, if I leave it open, they're on the meat. And the other one, if it's open and I let air get to the meat, no maggots because the flies can't get to the meat. And then on the first one, no air, no flies in the area at all, and no maggots. Clearly, he's like, living things have to come from other living things. The maggots came from the flies, right? Makes sense, right? Everyone was like, no. He's doing some wizardy sorcery stuff over there, okay? It was crazy. Back in the 1600s, people just, little different forms of thinking. But anyway, to review, controls and control groups, two different things. Control groups, guys, these are things, if you remember from, I think this was chapter 1, yeah, back when we were in school. Control groups, this is the group we know the outcome of. In other words, for Redi, he knew that if he left it completely open, the flies were going to get to the meat and there were going to be maggots on the meat. That was his control group. Now, controls are different. Controls are things that are kept the same throughout the whole experiment. In this one, the controls for the jars were the same. And the meat was the same, okay? Independent and dependent variable, again, another more terms from chapter 1. Independent variable, that is what you can change. I know we went over a goldfish example in class, but in this one, independent variable, the independent variable for this one is what Redi changed. So we didn't change the jar, he changed what was on top of the jar, whether it was a cork, whether it was the gauze, or whether it was just nothing. Okay, so what was on top of the jar, that's the independent variable. That's what Redi changed. Then after that, the dependent variable is what comes out of the change in the independent variable. So the dependent variable for this one would be where the maggots formed at. Did they form on the meat? Did they form on the gauze? Did they form nowhere at all? Okay, that's the dependent variable. That's the outcome of the change in the independent. Okay, so that was it with Redi's experiment. After that, we went to Spallanzani's experiment. Okay, that's a fun name. I know Kate out there probably has, like, from all the bio people we went over this year, he's like, yeah, I'm naming my kid that one. So I think this would be like Cade's 8th kid or something like that, and he'll give that kid the name Spallanzani. Yeah, it's fun, right? Anyway, getting away from Cade. So people didn't quite believe Redi. They still believed in spontaneous generation. So during the time of Redi, Spallanzani came out, and he's like, okay, well, we got these new fancy microscopes and stuff like that. I'm going to use microorganisms. Why not, right? People didn't have anything better to do back then, so they were like, oh, look at these new microscopes. They were like the most fascinating things ever. So he's like, oh, if I use the microscope, maybe people will believe me because I'm fancy. But anyway, so microorganisms, guys, when I'm referring to them, I'm referring to like bacteria and stuff like that. So his hypothesis was that even though the microorganisms can get to something, okay, like through the air, just air getting to it doesn't mean that microorganisms are forming something. But what he wanted to do was he wanted to just pretty much say that if air carries microorganisms, if the air with the microorganisms can get to something, the microorganisms will get in there and they will reproduce. So what he did for his experiment, I'll go over the picture for you. He put gravy or broth in a flask. And the first thing he did was boil the broth. All right, well, why did he boil the broth? Well, microorganisms or bacteria could already have been in the gravy or the broth. So what he wanted to do was make sure it was all dead. It couldn't reproduce anymore. All right. And then after that, if you look in the top middle picture, in one, he left the flask completely opened. And in the middle bottom picture, what he did was he actually melted the glass to form a seal so that air and microorganisms could no longer get into the flask. And then he let it go for a few days. And on the top, if you notice, the one that was exposed to the air with the microorganisms formed a lot of more microorganisms in the inside. It kind of got gross, moldy, disgusting, something you totally wouldn't want to drink. On the bottom one, the flask got sealed and the air wasn't able to get to it, meaning microorganisms weren't able to get to it, and then the gravy was completely free of any kind of bacteria. All right, so that was his conclusion, and he thought, all right, clearly this disproves spontaneous generation. So living things have to come from other living things. All right, and that was it. And he's like, okay, with me and Redi together, we got a pretty firm case here. Yeah, people were like, no. We need air to get to it. If there's no air, then the whole thing doesn't work. So everyone's shaking their head at this times. Okay, now real scientists were like, clearly, guys, this makes sense, but to the normal person, they're like, oh no, no, no. So in the 1800s, okay, wait. We started this off with Redi in the 1600s. You mean to tell me people were going on about this thing for 200 plus years? That's nuts. But anyway, so the Paris Academy of Science came in on the 1800s and they said, well, we need someone to be able to disprove spontaneous generation. And they actually offered a prize for it. Well, there's some crazy prizes out there like the Pulitzer, and you can get an Academy Award or an Emmy or a Golden Globe and all these things. And they said, no, 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 we will make a new prize for this person. Okay. They called it the Zecker Prize. All right. So what they did was they made a prize for someone in hopes that someone would bite and make an experiment to disprove spontaneous generation. Don't worry, someone did. His name was Louis Pasteur. And I know you guys right now are like, I've heard that before. You have. Louis Pasteur was the guy who made pasteurization in milk. In other words, that's the stuff that makes your milk like free of bacteria and stuff. You'll see two things on any single container of milk. You'll see homogenized and pasteurized. Homogenized makes sure all the fat's mixed in, that like you don't have like milk at the bottom and then just a fat layer on top. Be kind of gross, but that's how it was back in the day. And then pasteurization, again, makes sure that it's free of bacteria. So here's what Pasteur did. He took Spallanzani's experiment with the broth, still heated it right at the beginning just like normal. And then in the middle picture there, he put a swan neck on both of them. And the swan neck was open at both sides, so it allowed air to get in to the flask and reach the broth. On the bottom one, he snapped the swan neck off, meaning air could get right in, right to the broth, no problem. On the top one, if you look, the air had to go through the swan neck, up against gravity, and then circle back down to get into the flask. Okay? Much more difficult for air to get in the one with the swan neck compared to the one where Pasteur broke it off. All right? The one that he broke it off, he waited 3 days, and just like Spallanzani's, we had bacteria in the broth. Good. Those are our just replicating Spallanzani's results. The top one, however, the air was able to get in, but the bacteria was unable to fight gravity. In other words, go up the swan neck to drop down. Well, that was really, really good for his results, because all those naysayers out there that said, hey, we need air to grow things, okay? Non-living things can grow living things, but they need air. Well, what Pasteur did was he let that air in, so they couldn't say anything. That shut everyone up. All right. Cool thing was the one that he had the swan neck in actually remained clear for about a year, which is crazy. That's a heck of a shelf life there. All right. And then his conclusion, guys, again, he won the Zecker prize from the Paris Academy of Science, and yeah, he was able to disprove spontaneous generation using the swan neck. Okay, and that's why we think, or we agree with the theory of biogenesis now that states living things come from non-living things. All right, guys, that's it for today. Have a good rest of your day.